The rain fell hard that Tuesday evening, making small rivers along the sides of the road near Palm Beach. Officer James Wilson rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the clock on his dashboard. Only 30 more minutes until his shift ended. The wipers of his police cruiser worked overtime, fighting against the downpour that had started just an hour ago. James had been a state trooper for 12 years now. At 41, with a slight touch of gray in his dark hair, he had seen just about everything on these roads. His wife Beth would have dinner waiting when he got home, probably the pot roast she had mentioned that morning. The thought made him smile as he watched the traffic pass. Most drivers had slowed down because of the rain, which James appreciated. Fewer speeders meant fewer stops in this weather. His uniform was already damp from the last ticket he'd written, and he wasn't eager to get soaked again. As he sat parked on the shoulder, headlights approached through the curtain of rain. A black SUV with government plates was moving faster than the other cars, not dangerously fast, but definitely above the limit. James sighed, turned on his lights, and pulled out onto the road. "So much for staying dry," he muttered to himself, following the SUV. To his surprise, the driver reacted immediately, signaling and pulling over in a smooth, practiced motion. Most government vehicles meant either important visitors or local officials, and they didn't always stop so promptly. James radioed in a license plate number and his location before stepping out into the rain. The SUV had dark tinted windows, making it impossible to see who was inside. James approached carefully, one hand resting near his holster, a habit from years on the job, not because he expected trouble. Water dripped from his hat as he reached the driver's window and tapped on the glass with his flashlight. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a middle-aged man with a neat haircut and a black suit. He looked like a professional driver, which matched the government plates. "Good evening, sir," James said, shining his light briefly into the vehicle before aiming it down. "License and registration, please." "Of course, officer," the man replied politely, reaching slowly for his wallet. "Was I speeding?" "I apologize if I was." James noticed the man had an accent he couldn't quite place. Not local, that was for sure. The inside of the SUV was luxurious, with leather seats and what looked like security equipment. In the back, another figure sat in shadows, but James kept his attention on the driver. "You were going a bit over the limit," James explained, taking the offered license. The name read Robert Hayes. "Where are you headed tonight, Mr. Hayes?" "Back to Mar-a-Lago, sir. We're just returning from an event in town." James nodded, studying the license more carefully. Something felt off about this stop, though he couldn't put his finger on why. Maybe it was the government plates, or maybe it was just the end of a long shift in bad weather. Either way, James found himself asking more questions than he normally would. "You said who else is in the vehicle with you?" James asked, trying to peer past the driver into the back seat. The rain was getting heavier, soaking through his uniform jacket. "I'm driving for," Hayes began, but James cut him off. "Could you step out of the vehicle, please?" James requested, his tone firmer now. "And I'll need to see your registration and proof of insurance." Hayes looked surprised but nodded. "Yes, sir, no problem." As the driver reached for the door handle, James took a step back, not noticing how the figure in the back seat leaned forward. He had no idea that this routine traffic stop was about to become the most surprising encounter of his career, one that would change how he viewed his job and himself forever. Robert Hayes stepped out of the SUV carefully, his black suit already getting spotted with rain. He stood straight, hands visible, obviously familiar with police procedures. The rain had picked up, creating a constant drumming on the roof of the vehicles. James noticed that Hayes moved with the careful precision of someone professionally trained, probably former military or security. "You're not from around here, are you, Mr. Hayes?" James asked, studying the man's face more carefully in the beam of his flashlight. Hayes had the weathered look of someone who spent a lot of time waiting in cars, watching doors, scanning crowds. "No, sir. I'm based out of New York, but I travel with my employer." Hayes' accent had hints of Boston in it. He stood patiently in the rain, not complaining despite the water now soaking through his expensive suit. James felt a slight twinge of suspicion growing. Government plates, a professional driver with a northern accent, expensive SUV, someone important in the back. In his experience, this combination sometimes meant trouble, diplomatic problems, or entitled officials expecting special treatment. And who exactly is your employer? James pressed, his tone shifting slightly. He moved his flashlight beam toward the back seat window, but the tint was too dark to see clearly. I'll need to see some additional ID, and can you explain your business in the area? Hayes reached for his wallet again. I drive for former president. Step back toward the vehicle, please, James interrupted, his training kicking in. Something about the situation was making him uneasy. Keep your hands where I can see them. Hayes complied immediately but looked confused. Officer, is there a problem? I'm just trying to. Just follow instructions, please, James said firmly. The rain was now running down his neck into his collar, making his discomfort worse. How long have you been in Florida? We arrived 3 days ago for a series of meetings and events, Hayes explained calmly. Tonight was a fundraiser for veterans at the Palm Beach Convention Center. We're heading back to. We've had reports of suspicious vehicles in the area, James cut in, not really listening to the explanation. His mind was already creating a profile based on bits and pieces, northern accent, vague answers about meetings, expensive vehicle. Can you open the back door, please? Hayes hesitated for the first time. Sir, I'm not sure that's necessary. My passenger is. I need to see who's in the vehicle, James insisted, his hand moving closer to his holster unconsciously. Years of training had taught him to be cautious when drivers became resistant. Just then, the back window rolled down smoothly. James directed his flashlight toward the opening and nearly dropped it when he recognized the face looking back at him. The unmistakable features of Donald Trump came into view, his expression calm but curious. Is everything all right, officer? Trump asked simply. James felt like someone had pulled the ground out from under him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The former president of the United States was sitting just feet away, watching him profile his driver on a rainy roadside. Mr. President, James finally managed, immediately straightening his posture. I apologize for the delay. I didn't realize. Trump observed him for a moment, taking in James's sudden change in demeanor. No apology needed. My driver was probably going too fast. Robert tends to worry about my schedule. James felt his face growing hot despite the cool rain. Just moments ago, he had been treating Hayes with growing suspicion, something about the man's accent, his appearance, the government plates making James ask more questions than usual. Now, seeing Trump, his entire approach had shifted instantly. Everything appears to be in order, sir, James said quickly, handing the license back to Hayes. You're free to go. Sorry for keeping you in this weather. Trump leaned forward slightly, rain hitting his suit jacket as he studied James's name tag. Officer Wilson, he said thoughtfully, before we go, would you mind if I asked you something? The rain seemed to slow down for a moment, as if nature itself was interested in what would happen next. Officer James Wilson stood there, raindrops sliding down his face, feeling like time had stopped. The former president was looking at him with curious eyes that missed nothing. Do you have a minute to talk, Officer Wilson? Trump asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. He motioned to the empty seat beside him. Maybe somewhere a bit drier. James glanced at his patrol car, then back at Trump. This wasn't in any training manual he ever read. Yes, sir, of course. His radio crackled, and he quickly called in that everything was fine, and he'd be occupied for a few minutes. Hayes, the driver, opened an umbrella and held it over James as he walked around to the passenger side of the SUV. The inside of the vehicle was warm and smelled like expensive leather. James sat awkwardly, suddenly aware of his wet uniform and muddy boots on the pristine carpet. First, let me say I appreciate you doing your job, Trump began, turning slightly to face James. Too many people these days want special treatment. James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His mind was racing, replaying how quickly his attitude had changed once he recognized who was in the car. I noticed something interesting just now, Trump continued, his expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. When you were speaking with Robert, you seemed concerned. Your questions got more pointed. Your hand moved closer to your weapon. James felt his stomach tighten. Sir, I was just following standard procedure for. Trump raised his hand slightly. I'm not criticizing you, Officer Wilson. I'm just making an observation. Then, when you saw me, everything changed." He wasn't angry or mocking, just stating facts. The heat of shame crept up James's neck. He'd been a cop long enough to know what Trump was getting at. "Sir, I didn't mean to profile your driver. It's just that with the government plates and—" His words trailed off as he realized how weak his explanation sounded. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. He had made assumptions based on Hayes' accent and appearance. "We all do it, you know," Trump said, looking out at the rain-soaked highway. "Make snap judgments. I've done it my whole life in business. Sometimes it saves time. Sometimes it makes us miss opportunities." He turned back to face James. "Sometimes it makes us treat good people unfairly." James sat silently, the weight of those words settling on him. He'd always prided himself on being a fair officer, but tonight's interaction was forcing him to question that. "Sir, you're right. I did treat him differently once I saw you, and that's not right." The admission felt both painful and somehow freeing. Trump nodded, seeming to appreciate the honesty. "You know, I've been on both sides of this. People either love me or hate me before I even open my mouth." He chuckled softly. "Makes it hard to get a fair traffic ticket." The joke broke some of the tension, and James found himself smiling slightly. "What's your first name, Officer Wilson?" Trump asked. "James, sir." "Well, James, here's what I'm thinking. We all have biases. Every single one of us. The question isn't whether we have them. It's whether we're brave enough to notice them and honest enough to address them." Outside, the patrol car's lights still flashed, sending red and blue reflections across the wet pavement. Another car slowed as it passed, the driver clearly trying to see what celebrity or criminal had been pulled over. "What made you become a police officer?" Trump asked, seeming genuinely interested. The question caught James off guard. He'd been expecting a lecture or worse. "My dad was a cop," he said simply. "And I wanted to help people, keep them safe, make a difference, I guess." Trump nodded. "That's what most officers tell me. Good people trying to do right. But it's a tough job, having to make split-second decisions, often with limited information." "Yes, sir, it is." "So maybe the real question is, how do good people like you keep doing this difficult job while being more aware of those snap judgments we all make?" As Trump spoke, James noticed Hayes watching them in the rearview mirror. Their eyes met briefly, and James felt another wave of regret for how he'd treated the man. "That's a fair question, sir," James said, finding his voice again. He'd never expected to be having this kind of conversation, especially not with a former president in the back of an SUV during a routine traffic stop. Trump shifted in his seat, glancing out at the rain that continued to pour down. "You know what? Let's not rush this. Robert," he called to his driver, "would you mind pulling up ahead where we're not blocking traffic? Officer Wilson and I are having an important talk." Hayes nodded and started the engine, carefully pulling the SUV to a wider section of the shoulder about 50 yards ahead. James radioed in the new location to dispatch. "I need to follow protocol," James explained, somewhat embarrassed. "Always follow protocol," Trump agreed with a nod. "Rules matter." Once they were parked again, Trump continued their conversation. "I've worked with law enforcement for years, both as a businessman and as president. Good officers like yourself are the backbone of our communities." He paused, looking directly at James. "But I've also seen how easy it is for anyone to fall into patterns without realizing it." James thought about the hundreds of traffic stops he conducted over his career. How many times had he made similar assumptions without someone calling him on it? "I don't want you to think I'm normally like this," James said quietly. "My partner Tom, he's black. Would have called me out in a second if he'd seen me tonight." Trump raised an eyebrow. "Having diverse teams helps, no doubt about it. But we can't always rely on others to check us, can we?" Outside, a truck drove past, slowing down to look at the police lights. James noticed a man in the passenger seat holding up a phone, probably taking pictures. "Someone's filming us," James mentioned, suddenly conscious of how this might look. Trump shrugged. "Let them. Maybe seeing an officer and a former president talking calmly might be good for people to see. Too much division these days." James nodded, thinking about the heated political arguments that even his own family had at Thanksgiving dinner last year. His brother-in-law and father barely spoke anymore because of their different views. Sir, can I ask you something? James ventured. Go ahead. Why aren't you angry with me? Most people in your position would have pulled rank, called my supervisor, made a scene. Trump laughed softly. Would that have helped anything? Would it have made you a better officer or me a better citizen? He shook his head. I've learned, sometimes the hard way, that there's more power in a conversation than in a confrontation. The rain was letting up now, the heavy downpour becoming a gentle patter on the roof. Through the windshield, James could see stars beginning to peek through breaks in the clouds. Look, I'm not perfect either, Trump continued. Far from it. I've made plenty of snap judgments about people that turned out to be wrong. Cost me good employees, good deals, good relationships. He paused. But when someone shows me I'm wrong, I try to learn from it. James thought about his 12 years on the force. He'd seen a lot of changes in policing, attended countless training sessions on bias and community relations. But somehow, this conversation felt more real than any of those. I appreciate you taking the time to talk instead of just driving away, James said honestly. Trump smiled. Well, I was tempted. It's been a long day of meetings, and there's a good steak waiting for me back at Mar-a-Lago. He stretched his shoulders, but some things are more important than dinner, even a good one. Hayes turned slightly from the driver's seat. Sir, Ms. Chen just texted. The team is wondering about our delay. Tell them we're having an important discussion about law enforcement, Trump replied, then turned back to James. My staff worries if I'm 5 minutes off schedule. My wife's the same way, James found himself saying. If I'm late for dinner, she starts calling hospitals. They both chuckled, and for a moment, it was just two men talking, not an officer and a former president. You know what might make this conversation even more useful? Trump said suddenly, leaning forward with new energy. If Robert joined us. After all, he's the one who experienced your questions firsthand. James felt that twinge of discomfort again but nodded. You're right, that would be fair. Trump tapped on the partition, and Hayes turned around. Robert, would you mind joining our conversation for a moment? Of course, sir. Hayes turned off the engine and came around to the back, sliding into the seat across from them. He glanced at James with a guarded expression that made the officer's stomach twist. Officer Wilson and I have been having a good talk, Trump explained to his driver. About first impressions and quick judgments. Hayes nodded politely but said nothing. James cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes, I owe you an apology. The way I approached you earlier wasn't fair. I made assumptions that weren't based on your driving or anything you actually did. Hayes studied him for a moment. May I speak frankly, officer? Please do, James said, bracing himself. This wasn't my first experience like this. Hayes spoke calmly, no anger in his voice, just stating facts. I've been driving for important people for 22 years. I get pulled over more than you might think, especially in certain neighborhoods or communities. James nodded, feeling the weight of those words. Usually I just stay polite, follow instructions, and move on with my day, Hayes continued. Getting upset doesn't help, and most officers are just doing their job. But I noticed the patterns. Trump listened quietly, letting Hayes speak. I was Navy before I started driving, Hayes added. Served 12 years. Sometimes I wonder if I should mention that right away during traffic stops, but then I think, why should I have to? James thought about his own brother who had served in the Marines. How proud they all were of his service. How no one should have to use their military background as a shield. You shouldn't have to, James agreed. And I'm sorry. Something shifted in Hayes' expression, not quite a smile, but a softening. I appreciate that. Most people don't take the time to reflect like you're doing. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing a sky full of stars. A car drove by slowly, and James noticed more phones pointed their way. Word was getting out that something unusual was happening. This reminds me of something I learned during my first campaign, Trump said, looking between the two men. I was in a small town in Pennsylvania, and I met this factory worker. Tough guy, worked there 30 years. He told me straight to my face he didn't like my politics. Trump chuckled at the memory. Most politicians would have moved on to someone friendlier. But something made me stay and ask why. We ended up talking for 20 minutes. Didn't change his vote, probably, but we both walked away understanding each other better. That's rare these days, Hayes commented. People don't usually cross those lines. Too comfortable in our bubbles, Trump agreed. Everyone watching news that tells them what they already believe. James thought about his own social media feeds, how the algorithm seemed to show him only things that matched what he already thought. It's like we're losing the ability to talk to people who aren't exactly like us. The three men sat quietly for a moment, letting that thought sink in. So what happens now? Hayes finally asked. Trump looked at James. That's up to Officer Wilson, I suppose. We were speeding a little. James laughed softly. Technically, yes, but I think we've all spent enough time on this stop. He hesitated, then added, though I wouldn't mind continuing this conversation sometime. I have an idea, Trump said, sitting up straighter. I'm speaking at a law enforcement conference next month in Miami. Community relations is the main topic. Officer Wilson, would you consider sharing this experience? Not as some kind of public shaming, but as an honest example of how these conversations can happen. James blinked in surprise. I'd need to clear it with my department, but yes, I think that could be valuable. Hayes nodded in agreement. I'd be willing to participate too, if that helps. James looked between the two men, amazed at how differently this traffic stop was ending compared to how it began. My shift actually ended 20 minutes ago, he admitted with a small smile. Well then, Trump said, reaching for the door handle, let's get you back to your family. But first, he pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and handed it to James. Have your chief call my office about that conference. By the time James pulled into his driveway, it was almost 9:30 p.m. The house lights were on, and he could see his wife, Beth, moving around in the kitchen. He sat in his patrol car for a minute, still processing everything that had happened. The business card Trump had given him felt heavy in his pocket, a physical reminder that the evening had actually happened. His phone buzzed with a text from his partner Tom. You okay? Heard you had some kind of encounter with Trump. News traveled fast in their department. James texted back. All good. Tell you tomorrow. Crazy night. Inside, Beth was putting dinner in the microwave. There you are. I was getting worried. She kissed him quickly. Your pot roast's been ready for 2 hours. Sorry, James said, hanging up his still damp jacket. You're not going to believe the night I had. Beth looked at him curiously. Does it have something to do with why my phone's been blowing up with notifications? Lisa from next door texted saying she saw a picture of you with Trump on Facebook. James groaned. Already, that was fast. So it's true? Beth's eyes widened. What happened? As the microwave hummed in the background, James told her everything, the traffic stop, his initial reaction to Hayes, the conversation with Trump, and the invitation to speak at the conference. Beth listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from surprise to concern to pride. When he finished, she squeezed his hand. That took courage, Jimmy, to admit you were wrong right there in the moment. I don't know about courage, James said, shaking his head. I just knew I couldn't lie to myself about what happened. After dinner, James checked his phone again and whistled. It's everywhere. Someone posted a video of us talking on the side of the road. He showed Beth the clip. It was shaky footage from a passing car, showing James standing with Trump and Hayes under an umbrella, deep in conversation. The comment section under the video was already filling up with wildly different interpretations of what was happening. Trump putting a cop in his place. Officer making Trump wait like everyone else. Good. They're probably just taking a picture together. None of them came close to the truth. By morning, the story had grown even bigger. James woke up to a call from his sergeant. Wilson, what exactly happened last night? The chief's phone is ringing off the hook. Media outlets want a statement. James explained everything as clearly as he could, ending with Trump's invitation to the conference. There was a long pause before the sergeant spoke again. You know, this could be a good opportunity for the department. Real community outreach, not just the usual PR stuff. That's what I was thinking, James agreed, relieved. Come in early. The chief wants to talk to you. When James arrived at the station, he could feel eyes on him. Some officers nodded with respect, others looked curious, a few seemed skeptical. His partner Tom clapped him on the shoulder. Only you could turn a simple traffic stop into a national news story, Tom joked. The chief was waiting in his office with the department's public relations coordinator. On his desk was a printout of Trump's social media post from that morning. Had a meaningful conversation with Officer James Wilson last night after a routine traffic stop. Instead of tension, we chose dialogue. This is how we build understanding, one interaction at a time. Looking forward to continuing our discussion at next month's Law Enforcement Conference in Miami. The post had already been shared over 50,000 times. Wilson, the chief said, leaning forward, "I've been in law enforcement for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. The mayor's called twice already." James swallowed nervously. "Sir, I want to be clear that I admitted my mistake during that stop. If that reflects poorly on the department—" The chief raised his hand, stopping him. "Actually, it's quite the opposite. Accountability is exactly what people want to see from their officers." He gestured to the PR coordinator. "We want you to tell your story, honestly, without sugarcoating. Show people that real officers reflect on their actions and learn from them." James hadn't expected this response. He'd been bracing for a reprimand, maybe even disciplinary action. "Sometimes," the chief continued, "the most powerful training moments come from real experiences, not textbooks. Your traffic stop last night could be one of those moments." As James left the chief's office, his phone rang. The display showed a number he didn't recognize with a Washington, D.C. area code. "Officer Wilson, this is Claire Bennett from the National Law Enforcement Conference. We understand you'll be joining us as a speaker next month." 1 month later, James stood backstage at the National Law Enforcement Conference in Miami, adjusting his tie for the 5th time. The main hall was packed with officers from across the country, police chiefs, community leaders, and media representatives. "Nervous?" asked a familiar voice. James turned to see Robert Hayes approaching, looking sharp in a tailored suit. "Terrified," James admitted with a shaky laugh. Public speaking wasn't covered in the police academy. Hayes smiled. "You'll do fine. Just tell it like it happened." In the months since their rainy night encounter, a lot had changed. What started as a simple traffic stop had grown into something James could never have imagined. The video of their roadside conversation had been viewed millions of times. James had appeared on 3 morning shows, always with the same message: honest reflection about how biases can affect anyone, even good officers with good intentions. His department had embraced the opportunity, using James' experience to launch a new training program focused on self-awareness during civilian encounters. Officers were encouraged to reflect on their interactions in real time, asking themselves why they were making certain choices or assumptions. 5 minutes, Officer Wilson called the event coordinator, clipboard in hand. James nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "I'll be right behind you," Hayes reassured him, "and the president will join for the panel discussion after your speech." James had spoken with Trump several times since that night, planning this presentation. Each conversation had been surprisingly down-to-earth, focused on how to make their shared experience useful for others. The lights dimmed, and James heard the conference moderator announcing him. "Please welcome Officer James Wilson, whose recent encounter with former President Trump has sparked important conversations about policing across America." Taking a deep breath, James walked onto the stage. The bright lights momentarily blinded him, but as his eyes adjusted, he could make out the sea of faces. In the front row sat Beth, smiling encouragingly, alongside his partner Tom and the chief. "Good morning," James began, his voice steadier than he expected. "I'm not here because I did something extraordinary. I'm here because I made a mistake, a common one, and was fortunate enough to have that mistake turned into a learning moment." For the next 15 minutes, James told the story honestly. How he had treated Hayes differently based on unconscious assumptions, how his approach had instantly changed when he recognized Trump, and how that moment of awareness had led to an unexpected conversation. "The easiest thing would have been to ignore what happened," James continued, "to make excuses, to deny the pattern. The harder path was acknowledging it, right there in the moment. And that's what I want to talk about today. The courage to recognize our blind spots when they appear, not months later in a training session." As James concluded his remarks, Hayes joined him on stage, followed by Trump. The audience rose in a standing ovation that seemed to bridge political divides, a rare sight in today's polarized climate. During the panel discussion that followed, a young officer from Chicago raised her hand. This story went viral because a former president was involved. But these moments happen every day without cameras. How do we make sure officers take them seriously? That's the key question, Trump responded. It can't just be about who's watching. It has to be about who we want to be when no one's watching. After the conference, as James was gathering his notes, an older black officer approached him. 28 years on the force, the man said, extending his hand. I want to thank you. Most wouldn't have had the guts to admit what you did, especially not on a stage this big. James shook his hand. I just got lucky with how it played out. No, the officer replied firmly. Luck was Trump being in that car. Courage was what you did with that moment. 6 months later, James received a commendation from the governor for his contribution to police training reform. The program he had helped develop, called Real-Time Reflection, was being adopted by departments in 14 states. On the 1-year anniversary of the traffic stop, James received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed photo of him, Trump, and Hayes at the conference, signed by both men. Trump had written, "Some of life's most important lessons come from unexpected moments. Thanks for turning one rainy night into something that mattered." James hung the photo in his home office, next to pictures of his family and his police academy graduation. Whenever new officers visited, he would tell them the story, not as some claim to fame, but as a reminder that growth often begins with an uncomfortable moment of truth. And sometimes, if the light was right, James could still feel the rain on his face from that night, when an ordinary traffic stop changed everything.